Welcome back, students. This is Professor Bridget, and we are going over the female reproductive system, and this is part of chapter 27. So first of all, we'll go over the functions of the female reproductive system, and then we'll go ahead and look at the structures and locations of each specific organ. As we go through the female reproductive system, we'll do exactly the same as we did for male. We will begin with the gonads, where the reproductive cells, the gametes, are produced. In this case, the ova. Remember, ova is plural for eggs. Ovum would be singular. And then we'll look at the structures that transport the ova. And then we'll look at the structures that, or the region where fertilization occurs. And then we'll look at where fetal development occurs. And then very briefly learn about some of the hormones, not nearly all of them, but just a few of the hormones that help to maintain the reproductive cycle, that 30-day cycle that coordinates changes within the female reproductive system. So that'll be last. So we're essentially doing exactly like we did for the male. We are looking first at where the gametes are produced, the tubes in which the gametes travel, and then, of course, the site of fertilization where the two cells meet up, a sperm and an egg, and then looking at the structure that allows for fetal development. So we'll start with the ovaries, and the ovaries are the female equivalents of the testes, and this is where the gametes or ova will be produced. It's also the site of estrogen and progesterone production, and where the ovaries lie is in the peritoneal cavity, or you can say the pelvic cavity. In the pelvic cavity, against the lateral wall of the pelvis. I'll show you what this looks like in a second. And the ovaries are held in place by mesentery, so that's a double sheet of serous membrane, remember? And then ligaments. Now, these aren't ligaments that, like we've learned about in the beginning of class. They're not ligaments that connect bone to bone. These types of ligaments are connective tissue structures that anchor one structure to the next, but not bone to bone. And I'll go over those with you in a sec. So if we look at a posterior view of the female reproductive tract, one of the first things you'll see are these globular structures. Over on the left, this is superficial. Over on the right, that's deep. And so the ovaries are this structure right here on the left, and here is the right ovary. And the ligaments that are holding the ovaries in place are, one, what we call the suspensory ligament. And I know there's an arrow or there's a line there, but you can't really even see the ligament. I'm not sure what's going on. So we'll just draw it in. I'll make it yellow. And so imagine there being a ligament right here, and that passes behind the tube, and then it would anchor to the ovary. That would be the suspensory ligament, and that anchors the ovary to the lateral pelvic wall. There's the broad ligament, which consists of 3 separate regions, although you don't need to know the names of those 3 separate regions. But I do think it's important that you recognize what the broad ligament looks like. And so it's this whole, beigeish sheet that you see here. And of course, it's got different names for the different regions, but you're not going to be tested on that. So all of this makes up the broad ligament. And then one last ligament that helps to suspend the ovaries is this one right here. and that's called the ovarian ligament, and that anchors the ovary to the uterus. Here we see the female reproductive tract in a different view, in a sagittal view. And again, here's an ovary. And the uterus looks quite different now that you're seeing it in a lateral view. You don't see the other ovary, that's been taken away, right? So here's the uterus. And you don't even see any of the ligaments, really, that we just discussed. We'll go through each one of these structures, beginning with the ovaries, then we'll move to the uterine tubes, then to the uterus, then to the vagina, and then lastly, we'll really quickly cover the external genitalia, which are all kind of lumped into a term that we use, which is vulva. Okay. So here's a nice large view of the female reproductive tract. Very similar to what we saw a few slides ago, but this is a little bit more easy to identify structure. So here's that ovarian ligament, and this one actually shows the suspensory ligament right here. So that kind of suspends those ovaries, and then what also supports the ovaries is that sheet, that's that broad ligament. So that's maybe a little redundant, but another way to see the entire reproductive tract plus the ovaries. So let's move on to then the function of the ovaries, and that's to produce the female gametes. Ova is plural for eggs. Ovum is singular. So as we learned earlier, the function of the ovaries is to produce ova and to produce and secrete estrogen and progesterone. If we look inside the ovary, you can see these little follicles or these little capsules developing. And we'll go over how this occurs and the maturation of these ova. But let me just show you. Let me use a different color here. I'll use green. Each of these round structures that you see is called a follicle. And inside of those follicles is going to be where an egg cell matures, goes through meiosis. That egg cell is called an oocyte. Now, we don't use the term ovum until that oocyte is released from the follicle. So that's just a little bit of an explanation of the terminology for you. So let's go back a step here, and I'd like to draw your attention to the regions of the ovary. And kind of like we've seen before, it's got an outer region that we call the cortex. We saw that in the kidney, right? And then there's the inner region, which would be referred to as the medulla. And so in that cortex is where you're going to find the follicles or the capsules, the follicles, where the egg cell is developing. And in this picture, I also want to draw to your attention that you see these follicles in various sizes, and the size indicates the stage of development. So you can see in this ovary right here that you have some follicles that are very small, and that means they are not undergoing maturation quite yet. You see some that are a little bit bigger, some that are bigger even yet, and then until you see this one large follicle here, that would be a mature follicle. What I want to just make sure that you all understand is that as an egg cell or an oocyte develops inside of a follicle, the follicle gradually enlarges. In this photo, it's very easy to assume that these follicles and the oocytes on the inside gradually migrate around the ovary, because you see them kind of small here, medium size, even bigger, and then bigger. I want to make sure that you recognize that the follicles are not moving around the ovary. They're completely stationary. This author is just trying to represent the different stages of those follicles. So if we go back to this picture right here, let me get the right pin. These are all egg nests. You see how they're all, the primordial oocytes are all clustering together in that cortex? That's them. And so these are, okay, so underneath the microscope, we can look at the stages that these follicles go through. And this is representing the process of oogenesis. That's egg formation. And a female is born with all of the eggs she's ever going to have, right? All of these cells that could potentially become eggs that can be fertilized. And she's born with about 300,000. So she's got a finite number, right? And this is in stark contrast to spermatogenesis, or how sperm are produced. Sperm can be produced beginning at puberty all the way up into 60, 70 years of age, so the males have essentially an unlimited supply of sperm. Females have a limited supply of eggs. In this photo, in this progression that you see here from the beginning all the way to number 3, the authors are representing the stages of oogenesis. And what you see here is this cell right here is called the primordial oocyte. Primordial means ancient, or not old, but it means old. But it means, in this case, that it's the first stage of development, and surrounding the ovary in the cortex, you're going to see these primordial follicles existing in what we call egg nests. They cluster together. Egg cell oocytes that have the ability to be told under the direction of circulating hormones that they are to proceed with development. So those primordial follicles, the primordial oocytes develop inside what we call a primary follicle. And remember, the follicle is just a capsule. So I'll use yellow here. And here's the follicle itself. And on the inside is that developing oocyte. As development continues, the primary follicle turns into what we call a secondary follicle. And here is the follicle itself. It's not as obvious, but you can see the oocyte on the inside developing. One of the biggest differences that you see here is the follicle is larger, the oocyte is a little bit larger, but another feature that's distinct is the connection of the oocyte to the wall of the follicle. So you see these spaces right here? That indicates that the oocyte is starting to break away from the wall of the follicle. So these are all either, at least at the beginning, empty space or space that's filled with fluid. Whereas if you look over at number 1 in the sequence, you see how the oocyte is attached to the wall of the follicle. Here's the wall of the follicle here. And that cell is attached to the wall of the follicle. Then in number 2, that oocyte starts to break away from the wall of the follicle. And you really begin to see that also, or it's very obvious, in number 3 here. So again, here is the oocyte, and all of this space here is an area called the antrum, and that contains fluid. So you can see that the oocyte has lost its connection to the wall of the follicle, which makes sense because ultimately we want the oocyte to be released from the follicle. It needs to leave the follicle, and that's called ovulation. So you see that gradual maturation of the oocyte inside of those follicles in preparation for ovulation. Here's the drawing that your authors provide. So here are the egg nests, those primordial follicles, and then this is the primary follicle, and here's a secondary follicle. Look at the difference, how the secondary follicle is larger, and now you have areas where the oocyte is starting to disconnect from the wall of the follicle. And then you really see that here in the tertiary follicle. There's that big space called the antrum. So here is the oocyte. What will happen then at a certain point is the follicle will rupture. There will be so much fluid in here that it causes the follicle to rupture, and the oocyte is released. And this is what we call ovulation. So in ovulation, the mature follicle ruptures, and the oocyte is released into the pelvic cavity. Now this is really interesting, and I wish we could be in class to view the female reproductive system on one of our cadavers, but there's no direct connection between the ovary and the structure or organ that will pick up the ovum. This oocyte is released free into the pelvic cavity or the peritoneal cavity. Now, thankfully, there are structures that are going to draw that oocyte into the fallopian tubes, but for at least a moment or for some period of time, that oocyte is loose inside the pelvic cavity. And so this is in contrast to the male reproductive system. When sperm leave the seminiferous tubules, they go into the epididymis, where they wait for ejaculation, and then go immediately up the vas deferens and out the body. So there's an area in the female reproductive system where the egg at some point is not inside an organ, and I think that's a really neat thing to recognize. Okay, so the stage 4 here, or in picture 4, you see the oocyte being released, and this is pretty much the ovarian cycle, where the oocyte develops inside of a follicle. Ultimately, it's going to be ovulated or released into that peritoneal cavity. But what happens to the remaining follicle? So that remaining follicle turns into a structure that secretes progesterone. And then that structure will exist for about 14 days, and it'll gradually deteriorate, shrink, and become smaller. That structure is called the corpus luteum. That's what's left over from a follicle that has just released the oocyte. And then over time, it shrinks to become a structure called the corpus albicans. So let's look at what that follicle does and just have a look at it underneath the microscope. The empty follicle reorganizes to become an endocrine structure, a gland. It's going to secrete progesterone, and that helps to maintain the uterine lining for about 12 days. And that's because, assuming that the oocyte that has just been released gets fertilized, the progesterone ensures that the uterus, where the fertilized egg implants, is at its thickest and can accept a fertilized egg. It does that for about 12 days. After that 12-day period, the fertilized egg starts to secrete progesterone on its own, and therefore the corpus luteum is no longer necessary. So that corpus luteum, the structure in the ovary, is essentially bridging the gap of progesterone secretion. Corpus luteum secretes progesterone for 12 days, and by that time, if a fertilized egg is present, it has implanted in the wall of the uterus and is producing its own progesterone. If no fertilized egg is present, the corpus luteum still shrinks and degenerates, and then that's one of the triggers then for menstruation, ridding the inner lining of the uterus and starting over. We'll talk more about that in a second. So here's the corpus luteum, all of this, and then it gradually shrinks down to become that corpus albicans. Now, having learned that a female has all of the oocytes that she'll ever make, she cannot make any more after she's born, and there's a finite number, somewhere around 300,000. If all of those are present when the female is born, as a female ages, those oocytes get older and older and older and are more susceptible to problems during meiosis. And one of those problems during meiosis, if you recall, meiosis includes, at least in part, the separation of chromosomes. You have this cell that's about to divide in half to reduce its genetic information, reduce its number of chromosomes, and under normal circumstances, one new cell gets half the chromosomes, the other cell gets the other half of those chromosomes. But there are malfunctions in that process, especially as eggs, or these oocytes, these egg cells, age. And so one of those malfunctions or abnormality in chromosome separation is a condition called trisomy 21. That's what we would more commonly refer to as Down syndrome. And it's thought, at least in part, that one of the reasons we see cases of Down syndrome increase around the age of 35 is that eggs by that time are 35 plus years old. And the cellular machinery that's responsible for separating chromosomes equally sometimes fails, especially as women continue to age. And when that cellular machinery fails, at the 21st position, or the 21st chromosome, there should be, under normal circumstances, two. One 21st chromosome from mom and one 21st chromosome from dad. But what might happen is, if that cellular machinery malfunctions and mom's two 21st chromosomes don't split apart from one another, you'll have an extra chromosome. So there are 1, 2, 3 chromosomes now, and that's why this condition is called trisomy 21. Okay, we just left off on the ovaries, and we know that when an oocyte is ovulated, it leaves the ovary and ends up kind of free here in the peritoneal cavity. But that oocyte needs to be picked up or drawn into the next region of the female reproductive system. And that region is the fallopian tubes. And you can see the fallopian tubes here. This entire region is the fallopian tube. And the tubes can be broken down into subregions, and I'll tell you about those here in a second. But this egg will be drawn into the fallopian tubes and will gradually get transported down the fallopian tubes. It's in the fallopian tubes where an egg should meet up with a sperm. So this is the site of fertilization. That fertilized egg then should, under normal circumstances, make its way to the uterus and implant or embed itself in the wall of the uterus. So how does that ovum get drawn into the fallopian tubes? Well, one of the ways in which that happens is there are these little finger-like projections on the end of the fallopian tubes called fimbriae. And they have the ability to move a little bit and create a current to draw the egg into the fallopian tubes. But again, these tubes, the fallopian tubes, they're body tubes, and they're lined with ciliated simple columnar. So the cilia also beat to create a little bit of a current to draw that ovum into the fallopian tubes. So the fimbriae are the first kind of little section, or the structures on the first section called the infundibulum. So let me erase some of these and then I'll outline the infundibulum for you. Okay, so the infundibulum would be this region of the fallopian tubes, and it's the infundibulum that have the structures that we call fimbriae. The ampulla would be the next region, which would make up about this much of the fallopian tube. And then the remaining is what we call the isthmus. Now, you're going to have to make sure that you use these terms properly, that there is an isthmus of the fallopian tube and there's an isthmus of the uterus. So be sure that you specify isthmus of uterus or isthmus of fallopian tube if you're asked. A few minutes ago, I mentioned that fertilization occurs in the fallopian tubes. And implantation of that fertilized egg, a fertilized egg is called a zygote. That zygote should travel, I need to use a different color, I'm going to use black. That ovum, as I mentioned, should be traveling down these fallopian tubes and at some point meet up with a sperm. And fertilization occurs in the fallopian tubes, and normally that fertilized egg then implants in the wall of the uterus. But quite commonly, the fertilized egg, that zygote, can implant elsewhere. So when a zygote implants in an area other than the uterus, it's referred to as what we call an ectopic pregnancy. Sometimes these are also called tubal pregnancies. So you can see a condition here where a zygote might implant in the isthmus of the fallopian tube. It could implant mistakenly in the ampulla, in the infundibulum, or even like in the case of a supersperm swimming all the way out of the fallopian tubes, and if it just by coincidence that sperm meets up with an oocyte that's just been ovulated, then it's rare, but it can happen that the zygote implants on the outside of the ovary. And even rarer still, if an egg and a sperm meet up in that pelvic cavity. This is rare, totally rare, but it does occur. That fertilized egg can implant on the external side of the uterus or even in the abdominal cavity, in the abdominal body wall. And like I said, these are rare, but they do happen. They all will result in the zygote not being able to be carried to term. All of these locations are just not suitable for growth and development of a fetus. They can be particularly dangerous, especially in the fallopian tubes, because as the fetus grows, it will cause or create strain on the fallopian tubes, and eventually the fallopian tubes will rupture, and that will cause internal bleeding and or infection. So these types of pregnancies, these ectopic pregnancies, need to be terminated for the safety of the female, unfortunately. So from the fallopian tubes, the fertilized egg, the zygote, makes its way into the organ that is the uterus. So this entire structure here is the uterus, and it's a hollow body tube. It's a hollow body organ, and it's located in the pelvis, in front of or anterior to the rectum, but above and behind the bladder, posterior-superior to the bladder. You're still looking at a posterior view here, but let's go ahead and look at the regions of the uterus. So first up, there is the body, and that will be this main portion right here. There's a rounded portion at the top that we call the fundus, that's here. You might ask yourself, where have I heard that term before, fundus? Remember we learned that in the stomach, that was that upper rounded portion of the stomach. And then inferior to the body would be this slightly narrowed region called the isthmus. So you would have to distinguish here in a quiz that this is the isthmus of the uterus, not the isthmus of the fallopian tube. Another region of the uterus, and I'm going to zoom in here so we can, or maybe not. There we go. So we can see this region a little bit better. The inferiormost portion of the uterus is the cervix. So this is what I'll outline here in yellow. The entrance to the cervix from the uterus is called the internal os, so that would be the entrance. And the exit from the cervix is called the external os. And the cervix is embedded within its wall, has a number of mucus secreting glands. And so most of the uterine cycle, or most of the month, there is a mucus plug right here in that cervical canal. And that prevents microorganisms, pathogens, and sperm from getting into the uterus. When that mucus plug dissolves is when there is an ovum present in the fallopian tubes. So at mid-cycle, when an ovum has been ovulated, that's when this mucus plug dissolves, and sperm are then allowed entry. They're allowed to swim up into the uterus and hopefully make their way towards the egg. Otherwise, no egg present, no sperm or microorganisms can get through. So it's really a protective mechanism for the female uterus, not to allow anything within the uterus unless there's an egg present. So I just covered all of this slide, so I won't repeat that to you. From this view, you're looking at the female reproductive system from a lateral view, And here's that uterus. And you can see its position on top of the bladder. So there's the bladder. And that uterus, remember, is what we call posterior-superior, or posterior and superior. So that means the uterus is positioned behind the bladder and slightly above the bladder. If you've had children, then, or if you've carried a child, you know that as the uterus gets bigger and bigger, the urge to use the restroom becomes more frequent because that uterus is lying essentially right on top of that bladder and compressing that bladder. There are two positions that the uterus can occur in. In what you see right here is a position called anteflexion, where the fundus of the uterus is essentially pointing forwards, and that's about where 80% of women's, or the orientation of about 80% of women's uteruses. But it can, the fundus can point a little bit more backwards, and that position is what we call retroflexion. There isn't any, though, clinical significance to that. It doesn't affect a woman's ability to get pregnant or carry a fetus. It's just the two ways, or the variation in which the uterus can sit within that pelvic cavity. So the structure of the uterus is such that it's not paired, at least not in human females. So it's going to be this centralized structure right here with the three regions that we just went over. And it's a very muscular organ, very thick muscular organ, and we'll go over that, I think, in part 2. But it's a very thick, hollow body organ. Way at the beginning of the semester, we learned about squamous cell carcinoma, and remember that that is a type of cancer of epithelial cells. We learned about Henrietta Lacks, the female who had such severe and aggressive squamous cell carcinoma that her cells were sent all over the world for researchers to carry out their experiments on. A Pap smear is a procedure where a female goes into the doctor's office to have these cells, these squamous cells of the cervix, sampled. And the sample is looked at underneath a microscope to look for any abnormally shaped cells, which may be an indication, an early indication of cervical cancer. Cervical cancer is a cancer of squamous cells, so it's what we call a squamous cell carcinoma. So the sample of the cells from the cervix during a Pap smear is taken from this region right here. Here's another view in a different picture of that cervix. And this, remember, the cervix is the communication point between the uterus and the vagina. And this is the external os. That's the space, or that hole, the external os, is the hole that will increase in size during labor in a process called dilation. So during labor, the wall of the cervix here has to thin out so that the external os becomes wider to allow for the head and shoulders of the fetus to pass through. Many of you know that the maximum width of the cervix during labor is 10 centimeters. So 10 centimeters dilated is when a female is asked to push and help push the fetus out through the cervical canal into the vagina and into the external environment. And so that distance of the cervix, or the width of the external os, should be about 10 centimeters. Now, centimeters or the metric system isn't something that we commonly use here in the US. We use inches, so let me convert that for you. 10 centimeters is 3.93 inches. That's the width in which a female has to provide an exit for the fetus. 3.93 inches for a head and shoulders to pass through. So, call your moms, call your grandmothers, call all the females in your family and tell them how much they are appreciated now that you recognize that that space, that external os, gets only about, at the time of labor, about 4 inches wide. And especially say sorry or apologize to your mothers for the pain that you must have caused them squeezing through that 3.93 inches. If we look at the muscular wall itself, or the wall of the uterus itself, not just the muscular wall, the wall of the uterus is here, and it's got 3 sublayers. And those sublayers we're going to look at underneath a microscope in part 2 of the lecture, but let me just introduce the names for you. So the innermost one is called the endometrium. That's going to be, let me get the highlighter out, that's going to be this layer right here, the innermost layer. And then the next layer is the muscular layer, and that's called the myometrium. And that myometrium is, of course, that middle layer of smooth muscle that you see here. And then on the outside, it's going to be the externalmost layer is what we call the perimetrium. And that's going to be this layer right here, just on the outside. So 3 layers to the uterus from deep to superficial are endometrium, myometrium, and perimetrium. The outermost layer, the perimetrium, is a serous membrane. More specifically, we call it visceral peritoneum. The middle layer, the myometrium, is made of 3 layers of smooth muscle, and when they contract, they expel the fetus during a contraction. The endometrium is the innermost lining. That's going to be a mucosa, right? A mucosal lining of the cavity that is the uterus. The epithelial tissue there is simple columnar, and that overlies a glandular lamina propria. Remember, lamina propria is going to be made of areolar connective tissue, but also in a glandular lamina propria, there are going to be a number of glands there doing some secreting. The endometrium can be broken up into, let's say, 2 sublayers. Let's not say layers, let's say sublayers. The innermost, or the one that would be in contact with a fetus, for instance, the innermost sublayer is what we call the functional zone. And that's just beneath the simple columnar. And it contains the glands. And those glands plus the epithelium are sloughed off during menstruation. And then below that, deeper in the wall of the uterus, is the basilar zone. And this layer, the sublayer of the endometrium, does not get sloughed off during menstruation. It contains the structures that regrow the functional zone after menstruation. Now, a lot of this might seem like we're kind of jumping all over the place. We haven't really talked about menstruation. We haven't talked about some other things regarding the menstrual cycle, also known as the uterine cycle. We'll definitely do that in part 2. But we've got to kind of understand all of these terms and the structures first, and then we'll put the big picture together in part 2. If we just want to take a quick look at how your author represents these three layers, you can see that the outermost layer, the perimetrium, is here. The myometrium, the muscular layer, is here. And then the endometrium would be here. And you can see blood vessels all throughout, right? And those blood vessels, as they go towards our destination, are branching and getting smaller until ultimately you've got branches of blood vessels passing into that endometrium. And then also what you see here are glands. These are going to be uterine glands. They're going to secrete things like mucus and nutrients like fructose and glucose. But again, we'll discuss those in part 2. So that's it for part 1. See you in part 2.